As François Frey argues, throughout the 18th century, the three Louises sat at the top of the French monarchy, and they were the fountainhead of all public authority, all magistracy, and all legislation. Having named himself the Sun King due to his immense possession of power and sovereignty, Louis XIV was the epitome of the French Ancien regime. But in the second half of the 18th century, challenges were awaiting France. The ultimate consequence would be the French Revolution, replacing what it saw as an ancient and therefore defunct regime, by envisioning a society that was built on a completely different ideological foundation, shaking up the status quo and threatening the authorities of the monarchies in Europe. The Ancien regime meant the extensive reach of the monarch would be supported by negotiations done with the French nobles, who had helped France achieve its unity in the first place, some centuries ago. Thus, the monarchs had to negotiate each type of increase in their power over the society, but especially the nobles, who held seats in these parliaments. The French monarchy was in need of large sums of money to be able to sustain all the institutions that made up the monarch's might. A vast military both on land and on sea. The lavish lifestyle of the monarch himself, and the French colonies overseas, where they competed with their main European rival, Britain. In order to understand the economic foundations of this revolution, we need to look across the Atlantic. France was in a great rivalry with Britain at the time, who had strengthened its hand with the Industrial Revolution. It was apparent that these two powers would clash on the overseas colonies in North America. Therefore, the French were directly or indirectly involved in these two wars. The 7 Years' War has led the Bourbon monarchy to cede most of its colonial territories in North America to its adversary, Britain. Such loss of prestige had brought with it the economic devastation due to the military campaign and the loss of future profit from the colonies. With the war, France would face the economic downfall. Another blow would be the American War of Independence, in which the Catholic monarchy backed the American Republicans in order to minimize the repercussions of the 7 Years' War, whose financial burden hit France hard over the years. The 7 Years' War seriously worsened the monarchy's financial and political problems, encouraged criticism, but it did not make the French Revolution inevitable, as argued by Scott. By the signing of the Paris Treaty in 1763, which concluded the 7 Years' War, the French state debt had almost doubled in size. As a result, the monarch had to utilize means of taxation to maintain its empire, a decision that would bring about a political clash between classes in the French society. But the conflict went deeper than the French involvement in these wars, and beyond the economic means of France's survival. As described in 93, Victor Hugo's novel about the monarchists who revolted against the revolutionary Paris rule in 1793, it was obvious that the revolution wasn't just based on a deficit of a few millions. The economic debacle had also a political dimension to it. The French finance ministers, whom Louis XVI had replaced one by one, were helpless in the face of this situation. From August 1774 to 1791, the finance ministry had changed hands 13 times. When the young Louis XVI had succeeded his father, who died of smallpox in 1774, Jacques Turgot was the finance minister. During his time, he had managed to save 100 million French livres in the treasury in exchange for a series of austerity reforms and spending cuts at the palace, but he could not last much longer in his role as a finance minister. Such reforms had levied the burden on the clergy and the aristocracy, thus fueling a political turmoil that caused him to be replaced by Jacques Necker. The efforts of reform by Necker circulated around financial reforms and borrowing methods, as well as his ambition to continue fighting against the parliaments, but Necker was also relieved from the position. France, which had decided to become a party of the American War of Independence, seemed unable to bear the financial burden of 150 million livres. Calonne, who came to power as minister, put forward the land tax system to be applied to all classes as a last resort. But all these plans were failing, for there were not much to do but to apply a few financial reforms that would have to restrict the financial and/or political authority of some class, either the aristocracy, the clergy, or the monarch himself. In the end, Calonne too was replaced. In the years that followed, there were 4 more ministerial changes. Eventually, Jacques Necker came back to take over as finance minister. However, there seemed to be little to be done. On August 1788, as a result of bad harvests, economic disorder that had not recovered over the last 20 years, and political conflicts between the social classes and the monarchy, the French state had declared itself bankrupt. The Estates General, which had not met since 1614, would now convene and try to find a solution to France's economic problems. The king, whose power seemed to be growing weaker and weaker, was forced to revive an old practice from 150 years ago. The États Généraux, or the Estates General, which had not reconvened since 1614, were to be called again in May 1789, giving each of the 3 classes in the French society, representing the aristocrats, the clergy, and the people, 1 vote each. The Estates General would be voting on various taxation policies related to budget deficits. Meanwhile, the representatives of the Third Estate were disturbed by the fact that the people, who constituted the overwhelming majority of the population, had only 1 vote, while the combination of the clergy and the aristocrats had 2. In this situation, their 1 vote would not be enough to veto a policy that would crush the people under heavy taxation. But it would be wrong to say that the people in France had yet to develop a class consciousness of their own. In France, it was the bourgeoisie that spoke on behalf of the people. The bourgeoisie knew what they demanded. They knew as part of the Third Estate. They were comprised of everything. They were not represented at all in the French political order, but they wanted to be something. Ultimately, this emerging class of bourgeoisie would take the reins and carry out the French Revolution. Faced with the unfair distribution of the votes to be cast, the Third Estate, whose number of representatives had been doubled by Louis XVI just 1 year ago, but who still had only 1 vote, ignored the assembly the king was convening and met among themselves. The representatives declared that they would not leave until they had a constitution. On the face of their strong opposition and demand, on 9th of July 1789, Louis XVI was forced to acknowledge the existence of the newly established Constituent Assembly. Louis XVI, seeing his authority shaken by such an event, had little choice but to resort to oppression, given that he was already in trouble with the aristocratic class. He deployed 20,000 troops to Paris to suppress the people who disobeyed the king and attempted to revolt. At the same time, the representatives of the Third Estate, who were aware of the uprising in Paris, were calling for arms. As the people of the revolution would take their first steps by rushing to the Bastille to seize the gunpowder stocks for the weapons they had seized in order to clash with the troops, a leader among them was slowly rising to the top. A lawyer, born in north of Paris, in the town of Arras, was representing his people in the newly established National Assembly. His involvement in the Breton Club, which would later evolve in the Jacobins, had marked an important shift in the French élan vital. His influence over the new Constituent Assembly would shape the future of France forever. His name,
Robespierre.